All right, so in talking about color theory in filmmaking, it's a huge part of what's called a mise en scène. And a mise en scène is a French term. It means everything in scene or everything in picture. And it basically has to do with the overall effect of everything that we see in a frame. And color ultimately can affect us emotionally, psychologically, and even physically, as we've talked about throughout the semester, often without us becoming aware of it. So you've probably really been affected by color theory in its application in film and never really noticed it. So, first, we're going to talk about the history of color in cinema and its origins. Um, Initially, obviously, we used to only have black and white film. And in the early developments of color and its application in film, it was actually painted on the film with oil paints, essentially. Oil paint is transparent, and film is made of um, a kind of plastic. It's highly flammable plastic. And initially, artists would have gone in much like they would have with the early invention of photography, and they would have literally hand colored each individual frame. And typically, there are 30 frames per second in most films. So it was fairly time consuming, as you can imagine, but it was also incredibly sophisticated. Um, One of the first forms of color photography in moving film that wasn't hand painted was called Kinema Color. And Kinema Color was really a much simpler system that actually used two colors, green and red. And it basically shot using one single lens, it shot at double the speed. And so it shot a photograph 30 times per second in the alternating colors. And what they did is they just simply overlaid that film together while they played it back. And obviously, it was kind of jerky and the color was really kind of off a little bit, but it did add color to film, which was pretty magical to early filmgoers. And one of the first ones was a very successful film called The Delhi Dunbar, or Durbar. And of course, if you're going to make a film about India, it's going to be pretty important that it be in color. The next advent we had in the development of color was in a system called Cinecolor. And it was basically a corporation in 1932, so it's not that far ago, really. And what they used is two films in what's called a bipack. So two films were actually placed in the emulsion. So it was actually two different lenses developed at a different time and then superimposed in front of each other, rephotographed, and then developed, and then simply played as one film. And what you see here is an example of that down here. And it's it's a little grainy. It's hyper colored, but it certainly was much more successful than the previous. And then we have what really caught on for quite several decades called Kodachrome, developed by Kodak. It was a subtractive color process. It was much more practical. And essentially, what it did is it used the RGB process and system that we currently use, red, green, and blue, rather than red, yellow, and blue like we're familiar with painting, right? So the subtractive process, like we kind of went over with early in the semester, this is the primaries when we're dealing with light. It's red, green, and blue. Um, and it recorded its colors on separate frames using a camera carrying two negatives, okay? So we used that for decades. And Technicolor was one of the first companies, had been around for a good while, that actually developed this and kind of perfected it. And still, really to this day, we still have Technicolor working. So color as it relates to mood, we can kind of separate that into three. We can associate warmer colors like orange, as I've illustrated here, with something that deals with personal experience, okay? Any colors that deal with sort of yellow, the sun, a kind of brightness in its evocation, it generally deals with tradition or culture. And then, of course, green almost always relates to nature, fecundity, wealth, right? But we also have these cultural associations with color. You've all seen Captain America. You've all seen Superman. Um, why do you think Superman and most of these comic book hero films are shot in red and blue? What do you think? Any guesses? What? Patriotic? Yeah, it's super patriotic. I mean, whether you know it or not, whether you think it, you're conscientious or not, you're watching Spider-Man, and it's evoking a kind of patriotism, ultimately just because of the color choices of his uniform, right? And it's a uniform, to be very specific, right? Uniforms are worn in the military. When we're dealing with colors like red, we're going to have a high emotive context. Okay, so red, you can always say, well, culturally, it's going to do this, it's going to do that. It might be physiologically, it might press you to be hungry, right? We paint a dining room red in order to increase hunger. The reality, though, is that it has a lot of different associations with it, and they are a heightened sensibility of emotion, right? So anger, passion, rage, desire, right? Danger. So those are generally colors that are pulled for that. And this is a bit of a who's who of best films. So if you're interested even remotely in interesting film, I'm going to talk a lot about films that I think that every single art student should see today. So hopefully you have your notebooks handy. Run, Lola, Run is a film about a young woman. It's a German film about a young woman who basically has 20 minutes to find $100,000 in order to save her boyfriend's life. And it's a very, very quick, moving, high intensity narrative that on impulse, you would automatically associate with a kind of action film, but it's far more complex. And it uses and pulls from heavily the color red down to the backdrops that she's running against and her hair color. And obviously the color red that we've seen in The Wizard of Oz, if you haven't seen that, it's a must-see. We're dealing with the color red because the shoes are evocative of a type of power. It's a type of magical power that ultimately gives agency and gives purpose to our main character. There's this wonderful quote by a famous director, Patti Bellatoni. If it's purple, someone's going to die, right? And so these are conventional things that really are pulled from the artists and the designers and the artistic directors who deal with film, right? But do we actually see the color? Is this something that is intrinsically a part of our training? Is this something that is embedded in us culturally? Is this something that is on impulse, something that we revert to physiologically in our bodies? And furthermore, do we really need to see that color in order to understand the narrative? As a viewer, no. But as an artist, absolutely. So color is often used to communicate what is not said, okay? So the famous director, Andrei Tarkovsky, he's a Russian director. He did a movie called Solaris. Solaris is a film about a man in space who sees his dead wife. He's kind of plagued by his dead wife visiting him on the shuttle. And in an interview, here's a great quote from him. He says, "At the moment, I don't think color film is anything more than a commercial gimmick. I don't know a single film that uses color well. In everyday life, we seldom pay any special attention to color. On the screen, color imposes itself on you, whereas in real life, that only happens at odd moments, so it's not right for the audience to be constantly aware of color." So Andrei Tarkovsky was really used almost black and white film almost all the way throughout his career until the very end, when he really kind of moved into the 70s with Solaris. So obviously his opinion changed. But he's saying here that it's vital that the viewer not be aware of the devices and manipulative conventions that are used upon them. So if we're thinking about the color red, we're thinking about, any of you recognize any of the films here? We've got one I can recognize right off the bat called American Beauty. And that's a film essentially about a man who's undergoing a kind of midlife crisis and falls in love with his teenage daughter's best friend and fantasizes about her throughout, even though, what ultimately the core of the image, the movie is about is personal struggle, right? Through these various vignettes of stories of one family, one American family. And this movie ultimately ends, and spoiler, I won't spoil it, but this movie ultimately ends on a really existentially downward slope that doesn't have hope in our own personal struggles, that ultimately says that we're not in control of that. even though he ultimately realizes he's in control of his own happiness almost before it's too late. If we're thinking about colors like pink, we're obviously going to have associations that deal with a lot of femininity because of the conventions imposed upon us culturally, right? We'll associate things with pink dealing with innocence or sweetness, and it's generally playful. However, it can be used ironically. As you see here, most of you have seen the Harry Potter films, and we've got, I can't remember her name, 10 points to Gryffindor, if you can remember this terrible school marm's name. Anybody? Mrs. I can't remember. But she is a kitten-loving, tea-drinking, prim, pink, obsessed fascist. So ultimately, pink can be associated with those things, but they can obviously be played with in order to reinforce the discrepancy of the description of the character. We associate orange with things like sociability and happiness, exoticism, and of course, youth. Yellow is more of a difficult color. It can be associated with this kind of brightness, but typically in film, it doesn't go over well. So it reads as a kind of illness, as a kind of naive or mad place and time. Green, we associate, as I described before, with nature, immaturity, and darkness, danger. And, we see The Hobbit here, and we see that Disney film with Angelina Jolie, I can't remember what it's called, and a couple other films that I can't, rattle off at the top of my head. And then blue, blue is really a wonderful color to pull from, I think, when we're dealing with narrative, in that it's very sterile. So it can come off as fairly cold, a little chilly. It can be very isolating. So blue is oftentimes used in order to reinforce the idea that you are indeed alone and that you're having a personal struggle. And it's very melancholic. And purple, it always means somebody's going to die, but it also is very ethereal. It's something that's associated with royalty, as we discussed in the pigment lecture, but it tends to be fairly ominous in that it portends that something's really going to happen that's going to be very disturbing. So one wonderful thing, an exercise for you to do at home when you're watching films, is to think about the color palette itself. And the color palette is ultimately the colors that are used that is ultimately predetermined on a mood board. And this color palette can be included not only in the artistic direction with the site and the time of day that the imagery is shot, or it can be utilized in what's called post-production. And post-production is the after editing process. And this can be done digitally. It used to be done by hand, but this can easily be done digitally with various programs today. And of course, we see the Revenant here, which is about an early pioneer on a gold rush who ends up having an epic battle with a grizzly bear. But he's alone in the wilderness, and it's very much about man versus nature. And so the coolness and the blueness of the state of the entirety of the film are ultimately about his isolation and the darkness that is in his solitude. American Psycho, if you haven't seen that, man, see that. Christian Bale at his best and his craziest. This film uses a lot of neutrals, but it's also a very blue film as well. It's set in the 80s, but it doesn't utilize a typical 80s color palette. And what's important about it is that those neutrals dull the interior spaces. It creates a kind of Caucasian tone of blandness and conformity. And the entire film is about a serial killer who is running amok, very quietly leading a secret life, as a Wall Street trader, a day trader, and doing very well in the uppy climate. Edward Scissorhands, one of my absolute all-time favorites, pulls from pastel colors. And those pastel colors ultimately are about conventionality. It is shot in the suburbs of California, and he is at objective description what you would call a freak. He is been a science project, essentially birthed we have a new entry, birthed by a mad scientist who essentially puts scissors on his hands. And he's entirely in this sort of leather kink outfit the entire way through and trying to assimilate into the normative, the very heteronormative white WASP culture of the suburbs of California. And Forrest Gump, of course, is very much about discovery, newness, life as an adventure. And so you're going to see a lot of not only the pastel colors, which are ultimately calming, but the very, very rich greens that are about the fecundity of rebirth and, newness. Jaws. Jaws uses an interesting color palette in that it's very much about the late 70s. And it very rarely sits on its laurels in terms of the expectations. So what we might think of in a horror film, which is what Jaws is, would be red and black and white. It doesn't really utilize that. It doesn't really pull it. It is a very conventionally shot film that its tension is really in how it's shot, not necessarily in the color use. Stanley Kubrick, he was a director that really did master manipulation, thanks to his obsession with color. And he's most notable and really aggressive at his use of the color red. And he did a film called 2001: A Space Odyssey. So while inside the computer, and the computer's called HAL, while inside HAL's processor core, Dave, the main character, slowly begins to deactivate the computer. So this otherwise really boring room is played as a hellish end to a nightmare, essentially, using red. So this dreadful, inescapable feeling is essentially, like his impending death. It would be missing if it weren't for Kubrick's use of red. On the other side of the spectrum, movies like this one, Her. It's called Her. Red is oftentimes evocative of feelings of love and passion. So the guy who directed this, his name is Spike Jonze with a Z. It's a perfect example of how film's entire meaning can be, communicated non-verbally, shot through composition and set decoration, essentially. This is about a man who falls in love with his AI, his computer, right? His computer voiced by Scarlett Johansson. So the walls, the clothes, the computer screens are all red. And the movie's hero, Theodore, he wears bright red throughout. He also wears blue and yellow and white shorts in order to communicate his emotional state. So we have very clear associations with these emblems. And the entire film is a perfect example of why color theory matters. Another film that you're all probably very familiar with, Mad Max, Fury Road. It's shot entirely in an orange tint. And what that does is it serves to amplify the really desolate, apocalyptic feeling of this landscape, right? It's barren, it's hopeless, it's endless, and it looks a lot like Mars. And it really does send the audience to another world. This is a film directed by a filmmaker named Wes Anderson. He is really brilliant at artistic direction. And this is a short film called Hotel Chevalier. Yes, that's Natalie Portman. And really the yellow here, really demonstrates feelings of happiness and relaxation. And it even plays with jealousy and betrayal. And it's really, yellow is one of those colors that can really just span the emotional spectrum. And really the shot above here was designed to communicate a kind of tranquility and a kind of peace. Even if the characters themselves actually struggle to realize it. A film called The Machinist, which actually kind of follows a man who he's a night worker. And throughout the film, we see his body decay. It's played by Christian Bale, and over the course of the film, he lost something like 60 pounds. And he gets so thin, he is an emaciated shell of a human being. So it's a very mundane and dull existence for him. It's very repetitive. And so he uses very dreary colors, very institutionally green colors. And this overtone of green was really used to examine the monotony of his inner life and his external life. This can also be seen in The Matrix. If you've ever seen The Matrix, also a must-watch film. And, pre-red pill. So as soon as he takes the red pill in The Matrix, it's shot entirely in green tones, just like this. Another film is Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood, about an early American pioneer of like a robber baron, right? He was an oil baron. And it sticks out like a sore thumb from the rest of the dirty beige colors of most of his movies. And this particular scene above, our central character, who is the like millionaire, greedy, evil, oil maven, he really is confronted by a kind of harsh reality that he's alone, right? And so he's in the middle of the ocean when he realizes this. His solitude literally surrounds him. Remember what I said about blue? It's all about solitude. And he really just realizes that at that moment. And then we've got the Grand Budapest Hotel. The Grand Budapest Hotel was directed by, yet again, Wes Anderson, one of my favorite, I think, favorite directors. And he uses this kind of really soft pink motif here in order to kind of investigate this childlike romance between these two characters above. So each are wearing these sort of archetypal colors. He's wearing, baby blue, and she's wearing baby pink, right? He's male, she's female. But it comes to fruition in this exact shot, in its sweetness and its pureness, in its, really honestly, lack of sexual energy and urgency about it. It's a very innocent love, and it blooms here. So a few filmmakers that I think are important to note, M. Night Shyamalan, he did, you could see The Village and really see the use of red brilliantly as it explores otherness and monstrosity. So in the film, The Sixth Sense, the I See Dead People film, hopefully you've seen that. Red is used in order to evoke that you are in the presence of death. And remember, this film is about a child who can see dead people, right? And the people around him do not. So whenever we see the color red, we know to expect that. In his film Unbreakable, he uses the opposing colors green and purple. And green is always associated with the hero, and purple is always associated with the villain. And the villain kind of is relying on his genius, right? Purple is generally associated with a kind of royalty, and green is the sort of wealth and richness. In terms of richness, what we're referring to is his mighty strength. Okay. In his film Signs, M. Night Shyamalan really plays with the use of the character that does not exist, which is the absence of the mother. The mother has died. And remember, this film is about aliens who exist and come to the earth, and it scares the hell out of everybody. But ultimately, whenever we see this kind of purple color, this kind of purpley blue, it's evocative of what's not there. And what we're really talking about here is the deity of the mother. Because the father, Mel Gibson, he plays a kind of lapsed pastor. He's lost his faith. And so the mother, the absence, is actually faith, God. In the movie The Village, I mentioned that before, it's about creatures that visit this, what seems to be a 19th century village. And whenever we see red, it attracts the creatures. It's the color that we shall not utilize. So they hide the color red. And whenever they find it, they're very afraid of it because it attracts them. And then whenever we see this sort of yellowy, this putrid yellow, we see this sort of almost like a protective veneer. Wizard of Oz, right? We can associate the ruby slippers with power and, of course, blood, death. The yellow is associated, the yellow brick road, associated with wealth and knowledge, and of course the emerald green, life and harmony. And then the particular putrid green that's used for the witch is virulent, right? It's destructive. If we think about films that utilize red as a kind of device in order to just get people through the door, it might not be used heavily throughout the film. It wants to convey the notion that this is ultimately about a kind of defiance. It is lusty. It is dramatic. There's a wonderful, wonderful film that was made in, I think, 1998 called Schindler's List. And it is about a man named Schindler who secretly opened up a kind of workhouse that saved Jewish lives from the concentration camps. And in it, the entire film is shot in black and white. It is one of the most difficult films you'll probably ever see. So prepare yourself if you sit through it. In it, we have a little girl, and she is literally the only thing in the entire 2.5 hour long film that is in color. And so her coat is not pink, of little, the color of little girls. It's red. And so it's robbed of its power. So I'll read it here. The irony of personalizing this color that symbolizes both birth and death sets us up for the shock when we, at last, in the end, see her dead in a pile of nameless corpses traveling to a mass grave. So it's incredibly poignant and very thoughtful. Yellow, we yet again would associate with the obsessive and caution. Age of Innocence by Martin Scorsese in 1993. Very passionate movie. And of course, Taxi Driver, where a taxi driver loses his mind and goes on a killing rampage as he stalks his dream girl, who is played by, problematically, a 14-year-old Jodie Foster. Blue, of course, Powerlessness. The Shawshank Redemption. Man, that's one of the top, God, yeah, I think that won Best Picture that year. Blue here is not only about the isolation that I addressed, but also powerlessness. A lack of agency and a lack of rights. Purple, we can associate with murder, mystery, and illusion. In films like Sin City, color is used highly selectively in black and white in order to punctuate them, obviously, right? We know to pay special attention to the evocative, emotional state or the purpose of a character by the colors that are used in that. And the last film I'll deal with today is called Memento. And Memento is a film that's shot backwards. What do I mean by that? A man wakes up every single day having lost his memory. And every single day he discovers all across his body in a hotel room these clues, in these tattoos. It's a kind of instruction manual for his memory. And so the movie moves all the way back, and it starts in black and white, and it fluctuates back and forth between black and white and color. And ultimately, that really does toy with the notion of memory and how tenuous it really is. So, some lessons we'll end on. Color simplifies complex stories. Sometimes you can rely on color as a means to simply state what the composition does not, or what the characters cannot verbally do. Color makes an audience feel, physiologically, but also culturally. Color shows a character's journey. It tells us what to expect often. I'm not going to show you the video clip since I